Welcome to Counterpoint, Columbia's and CAT TV's very own civics forum. Tonight we have three panelists. One on my left is Kat Hughes. She's a city reporter for the Columbia Daily Tribune. She's been covering city issues and the city council since she started with the Tribune in September of 2007. I might add just an editorial comment. It's been a pleasure working with her for the time that I've worked with her since she's taken this position. Mark Farnan on my far right is a partner and strategist, LLC marketing, public relations, and public affairs firm based in Columbia. He is the past president of the Hawthorne Foundation, specializing in economic development initiatives for the state of Missouri. The current president of the Enterprise Development Corporation and is a frequent guest host and analyst on KFRU's morning meeting. On my immediate right is Mike Martin. Mike is a science journalist and member of the National Press Club. He writes the Citizens Journalist column for the Columbia Business Times and maintains a well-known alternative news blog called Columbia Heartbeat. The last episode we had of this show, we kind of ran out of time. We were discussing some of the issues that had to do with the recent City Council retreat. We covered some of the issues, not all of them. Some of the ones that I really wanted to get to that we hadn't covered, I think we may be able to take up at this meeting. One of those issues has to do, we left the end of the last meeting on economic development. And let me bring you up to date a little bit on economic development. We discussed it reasonably thoroughly, I thought. But recently I had the privilege to be invited to the Chamber of Commerce's Emerging Issues Committee. And they invited me to address that group, suggested a couple of topics, and the topics that we all agreed on were leadership and empowerment. The growth management planning was the second issue, and form-based zoning was the third issue. We didn't have enough time. We never have enough time in these forums anyway for an hour's worth of time. But it was very instructive and very interesting. The exchange between and let me give a caveat. I'm the Third Ward City Council person for the City of Columbia, but I'm not here in an official capacity, although obviously what I do colors what I have to say. It was an interesting exchange with the Chamber's group. They were primarily interested, they were worried to a great degree about the empowerment that's happening with neighborhood associations. They didn't understand what this is all about, essentially, and we came to some agreements in this discussion that everybody needs to play by the rules. Neighborhood associations, if they are organized properly and if they want to contribute properly, ought to also have adequate minutes. They ought to be responsible for the decisions that they make, but that this also ought to be across the board. That is, the development community and the business community ought to subscribe to the same guidelines that the neighborhood association community subscribes to. I guess that's where I want to start with this in terms of empowerment, because to me that was the essence of the leadership and empowerment segment that I suggested to them. That is, how do you feel about this? There are obviously neighborhood associations are gaining their legs, so to speak. I mean, the city council to some degree is supporting these groups. We have a suggestion and some staff reports to suggest that we ought to support these groups in terms of bringing them along. How do you see this balance, and where do you think we're going with this issue in terms of empowering not only the business community but also the neighborhood association community, the citizen community?
Well, Carl, I think that where we start probably ought to be looking at where we are. Currently, in this community, we have numerous citizen-based groups who represent the different neighborhoods, and they've been recognized for some time by the city in an official capacity. and are allowed to form. The problem is at this point in time, however, there are different levels of competency among those groups that are all recognized with equal, that there is no distinction between them. This group represents this neighborhood, this group represents this neighborhood. Some do it better than others. I live in the grasslands. Our neighborhood association has been remarkably active for years, not only when there is a problem at City Hall or we want to come protest something or support something, but also just in terms of neighborhood communication. When we have a system in place where if a note or a notice or a ballot or a vote is to take place, within 3 days, everyone in the neighborhood gets a personal invitation that is dropped at their door. We have 100% contact with the residents of our neighborhood. East Campus is fairly well organized as well. There are some that don't even know if they're officially chartered or not. And before I think we go wholesale saying we're going to give a broad brush of recognition to all of these groups, I think that what you pointed out is that there needs to be some codification and some expectation that this will be professional, that it will be broad in its representation and not isolated or singular in its representation. For instance, you have two loud people in one neighborhood. They should not necessarily carry the day, even if they are the only ones who are willing to stand up and go to the meeting. It needs to be broader than that. And that's where I think we need to start there.
The problem with that idea is that you start to introduce controls into a populist political system of neighborhood associations. And this idea that there are different varying levels of competency is true anywhere you go. It's true in government, it's true in private business, and it's true in neighborhood associations. So to ask all of the various neighborhood associations, many of which represent very poor communities, to meet certain levels of competency, I think would have the tendency to drain a lot of the spirit out of these kinds of discussions and debates. And I don't like this idea that certain loud individuals need to be somehow silenced or fettered in some way. The reason for that is that those loud individuals form a critical check and balance in a community like this. The problem is that a lot of them get dismissed as cranks and crackpots and whatnot by the people that don't subscribe to that. You were part of this. You've been one of them.
Right.
And so and not every neighborhood association can be like the Grasslands, because the Grasslands is a community of citizens that are a little bit higher income.
Or East Campus or Benton Stevens. We can pick any of those. We shouldn't
Exactly,
just pick on the Grasslands as being economically advantaged.
Well, North Central has a very active neighborhood association
That's right.
that is economically disadvantaged. In a lot of places.
Let me say this. I mean, there is this dialogue going on about empowerment of neighborhood associations and the extent to which they can answer questions that the development community or people that bring applications before the Planning and Zoning Commission and the City Council, how they can answer. These are quasi-governmental bodies, essentially. The problem here, I see, is that there aren't many rules. You know, but frankly, there aren't. That is, the rules about making sure that you have the right kinds of minutes, making sure that you can account for the number of votes that you had, making sure that the questions are reported, making sure this is all public knowledge. But the flip side of this is that the development community and the business community has to be held to the same standard. I don't have a problem with empowering neighborhood associations if I can empower the business community and the development community in the same way. That is, they all too have to subscribe to minutes, and they have to subscribe to the votes, and they have to subscribe to the open meetings. There are a lot of situations where the business community meets with the city staff to agree to, in terms of agreements or getting towards agreements, that is very confidential. Those things are not, those are, and that's a lot of contact that occurs before a lot of the public has any idea about what's going on. Now, I appreciate confidentiality, and when you're talking about dollars and some of the contracts that we're talking about,
That's right.
I think that's an important thing. I
Land
mean,
sales.
we have to pay some attention to that. But I do think that if we are going to embrace this engagement concept, which I think is in the best interest of this community in the long run, we have to have the same rules from the business community that we do have to have for the neighborhood associations.
Well, if the business community is recognized by the city as an entity that has standing, much like it's being proposed to do for neighborhood associations, that would be true. But what we're not going to do, and I don't think it would be wise, and I don't think anybody would agree to it, is to say that if there is a corporation that wants to make a proposal that is going to impact a neighborhood in some manner, that they would have to hold their board meetings in public and subject themselves to public meetings. That the sunshine or any other, that won't happen, and I don't think should happen, unless they are given the same status. Right now, there has been a proposal that's being considered, and several business owners in one part of the community basically applied for the same kind of recognition that would be given to.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. This is the North Central
Yes.
Business District, which was kind of subverted. It was supposed to be a neighborhood association, and they came before the city council to suggest that they just want the same rights that any neighborhood association would have.
Right.
And I agreed with them. I thought that's what they ought to have.
And with those meetings, those would be open. But we're not going to open up everybody's board meeting and tell them what they're thinking 3 years down the road in terms of land acquisition, sales, development plans. We don't open it up to.
Do you think that the city's new notification procedure of the minute an application is submitted, sending out a notification to neighbors helps with that situation because you get it at the very beginning instead of when things are coming before P&Z?
It does help, but I don't think it's enough. I mean, we're talking about applications that have been in the works probably for a year or so before we ever get to the point that we have to have notification for, in general notification for the folks that are involved. Now, I don't know whether I agree with you or not. I mean, I appreciate the fact that there is a necessity for some confidence, particularly when it comes to some of these contracts.
Right.
I'm not sure I know what the solution is to this. All I know is that is often the source of some of the problems between whether the neighborhood associations think that the businesses or the applicants have an advantage or not, because they've been negotiating with the city staff for a long time before some of the neighbors are even aware of what's going on. I mean, this is a real sticky problem.
Well, and not only that, so many of these projects are publicly subsidized that they invite this level of public scrutiny, and it becomes ethically and morally kind of wrong to say, well, no, we want a TDD, we want a TIF, we want this kind of a subsidy or that kind of a
Publicly
subsidy.
subsidized
Right.
because of TDDs.
Exactly, and then to say, but we don't want a lot of public scrutiny, whether it be from neighborhood associations or whomever, and I think that's, but that invites public scrutiny because it's a public-private partnership, and in the end, often of questionable benefit to the public. So many of these big, high-profile projects that have drawn in the interest of neighborhood associations have also been very much funded by TDDs. They've been a huge issue here. And that seems like having it both ways. Well, we want all this public subsidy, but we don't want the public scrutiny.
Let's back up, just for the
That
audience
seems unfair.
out there. A TDD is a Transportation Development District.
Mm-hmm.
This is an entity that is established by the state, is granted by the state, by the state judiciary, essentially. The city has no role in this. This is an organization that combines itself to get together to establish a way to reimburse themselves for infrastructure projects that the city is not capable of offering at the moment because we simply don't have the kind of cash.
It's an added tax
Right.
normally
Yeah,
to sales.
usually
that-
and
that
at this point,
paid-
it's
yeah,
anywhere
right.
from 0.5% to 1%. In this
And-
case, 0.5%
and-
is the
But
mode.
the establishment of each of those districts is a matter of public record.
It is a
And
matter of public.
public
But-
record
It is.
before it's implemented.
But getting to that point is where the public comes in, and because that's a creature of the judiciary, having this public involvement is kind of an ad hoc way of assuring that there is some kind of public input. If it were legislated, maybe that wouldn't be maybe it wouldn't be as necessary, or people wouldn't feel the need to get so involved. But they have to because it all goes through the courts, and that proceeding in and of itself is much more closed than it would be
Unfortunately,
if it were
the
in
public
front of the
is
city council.
The public is invited to participate in the meetings, but the public nor the city has any jurisdiction over these TDDs. These
Unless the city becomes a member of.
well,
or
the
partner
city
to.
can collect the dollars.
That's right.
But the city is really never a partner in these TDDs. I'm not suggesting that TDDs are wrong. I mean, sometimes
Right.
you do need the infrastructure and there's no other way to do it, and this may be an appropriate way to do it. What I'm suggesting is there are some downsides to this. That is, the city almost always buys into these TDDs because the powers that be, the folks that make these applications, everybody's working in the public interest to try and generate revenue dollars so we can pay our bills. There's no question about that.
Well, and they're trying to establish some of the infrastructure
Sure.
that is needed and is not used simply and singly by a particular landowner. It's used by the public at large. And
Absolutely.
that's what justifies it.
But the problem is, the other side of that equation, that's what justifies it, you're absolutely right. But the other side of that equation is that there is no real, it preempts the city's abilities to put their own dollars, their own taxpayer dollars, in projects where they want to because they're drawn into these TDDs to participate because they almost have to. That's the issue, and I suspect.
And you know what? These subsidies. I've been working on a story here about a hidden subsidy that most of the developers here take advantage of. It allows you to sort of bank vacant land as agricultural, as long as you have a few hay bales out there and sometimes an idle tractor. And essentially, what it's a kind of a hidden quirk of state law that allows a developer to buy some land that's been classified as agricultural, maybe used as farmland before, and then sort of leave it that way indefinitely. And I'm looking at a 133-acre parcel across the street from the Cronky estate, owned by Mr. Cronky, that appears to be classified like that is appraised by the county assessor for $40,000. It's over on the corner of Nifong and Sinclair. He's owned that for 10 years. He's paid virtually no property taxes on it. He's going to develop it most likely. There are gas lines in there, sewer lines, water lines, you name it. And the amount of that subsidy, and this is all over the county, it's all over the city, it's all over the state. When you add the amount of those unpaid property taxes up, it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. So again, my point is this. The subsidies are all over the place, and I don't know how much they benefit John Q. Public. And I think that the public involvement in questioning this stuff, and public involvement in neighborhood associations, et cetera, there shouldn't be any fettering or tamping down going on, because the power differential is so great between the big developer and John Q. Public that it really mandates that John Q. Public have an even louder voice, not a softer voice or a more controlled voice.
Now, that parcel of land, though, is not developed yet, right?
It isn't developed yet, and
so it should be assessed at the lower
Right.
rate by state law.
No,
He's
no.
not doing anything.
Well,
No,
and
that's
that protects
actually-
other owners that are on
Yeah.
the fringe who don't develop their property. Then, are they going to get assessed for more because of potentially what it's
no,
worth? Even if they don't
actually the
have-
law doesn't say that. It says it has to be actively used as farmland, not just
Right.
zoned
So if
that
I
way.
own a farm,
If you own a
on the
farm and you're
edge.
actively using it, and you're an active farmer, then that's fine. But if you own farmland and you're not actively farming it and you're just sort of banking it for future development, you're the one that would be hit with the property taxes, not the people around you who are actively farming their land.
So what would it be classified as then? Residential?
No, it would be classified as vacant farm.
Okay. All right, and that is then vacant, then it pays in an agricultural rate.
No, it doesn't.
Why?
It pays in at full market value if it's not being
Is
actively
that
used as a farm.
residential or is that commercial? Which one?
It's considered unused farmland
And
if
it
it's
comes
not
in
being actively used.
12%?
No, that's assessment. The actual appraised value is what the designation of the
But I
property
mean,
is
the-
based
the-
on.
The rate would be what, 12%?
The rate of assessment would be, actually, for vacant farm, yeah, the rate of assessment would stay at 12, but the appraised value would go from a farmland appraisal to a full market value appraisal, if it's not being used as farm. So,
I have
and,
no-
see, and this,
Yeah.
you see all this all over the
But
place.
what if you're not even using it as farm? You just have a home on a large acreage lot that's A1, which is what happens a lot in the county.
They allow you to use up to 5 acres around the home that's designated residential. And if you're actively farming the rest of it, then it would be agricultural. If you're not actively farming the rest of it, I don't think you see that very often where you see somebody that's no longer there. But if it changes hands, that would trigger a redesignation or could trigger it.
I would like to kind of steer this towards your direction a little bit. You were at the, and we'll get back to that. I'm sure we'll get back to this appraisal assessment thing because it's critically important. You were at the retreat for the entire time that we were there. We covered the retreat the last time we had this discussion. We covered some economic development issues and so on. We didn't get around to the police issue, law enforcement issues. I hope we'll get around to those soon in this segment. But so you have a broad perspective, an objective, and which is one of the reasons why I invited you to this forum, because you're not one of the talking heads like we are.
She's not
we
as
have,
mean.
We have an agenda.
Yeah, that's right.
And all the rest of it. Well, I don't know about objective, but at least you represent the paper and you have a perspective on this. There was a great deal of criticism at the last retreat that the city council was taking a lot of heat because they were discussing their own favorite topics like national resources inventory, growth management planning, some other issues that were not as near and dear to the hearts of some of the business community as they would like to have seen, particularly CMDC, the Central Missouri Development Council. And I heard this criticism. God knows, I was in the lion's den the other day, on last Friday, when I gave a presentation to the chamber, and I'm a member of the chamber, but that doesn't matter. The chamber's Emerging Issues Committee, which is made up of very distinguished members of the chamber and very distinguished members of the community. Everybody would know their names if I ran them off. There was that sentiment as well, that the council was not really paying attention to some of the issues that they felt is important. And even though I was encouraged to talk about growth management planning because that group didn't understand it, and I understand that because it's kind of an esoteric concept, and form-based zoning, which is another concept that's not readily understandable, but we need to talk about more. I also presented some issues about leadership and empowerment, which had to do with neighborhood associations and so on. But what the folks there, regardless of what we had set up and what I was going to present, what they wanted to hear about was incentives. They wanted, it was all about incentives, and it was all about. And so I addressed that issue, although that wasn't my intention. And
What kind of incentive?
well, particularly TIFs. That was brought up a lot.
Pardon my laughter.
Well, I know, but and frankly, my position was, and I had just attended a conference in Charleston, South Carolina. And the emphasis of that conference, and I think the emphasis in general is that it makes good sense that if you're going to provide incentives for business, you spend at least 40 to 50% of your effort with supporting the businesses that are already
exist,
here, that
right.
exist,
Right.
and the other 40 to 50% with the businesses to generate businesses from those that already exist, and maybe 5 to 10% getting the big one.
To
I mean,
chase something.
The big one. It's
Colin,
like
that's
playing the
been the
lottery.
trend for years in economic development
Well-
and professional practice of it.
Well, if
Well-
that's true, though, then why is the Tiger Hotel sitting vacant? I mean, why isn't that done? Why haven't we incentivized those guys to finish that beautiful gem
Wait,
of a project?
So before I get
you know?
to you, I wanted to get to Kat here. I mean, in terms of your overview of what the retreat was all about. I mean, did we or did we not talk a lot about economic, even if it had to do with the National Resources Inventory, which I see as integral to development, future economic development, and the comprehensive plan and the growth management planning and all the rest of that stuff. Tell these folks what it is that we talked about. I mean, I'm getting tired of this stuff that we only spent, an hour on this
Well,
and
there
we
were a
spent
couple
10
of
hours
ads
on
that were run that
Yes,
kind of
there
poked
were,
it pretty good.
right.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
guys,
true.
you got to let her answer.
Yeah, and the thing was that those ads, which were paid for, I believe, by the Central Missouri Development Council,
prior to the meeting.
right, well, that's the whole thing, is that they were based on an agenda. And as anyone who has ever been to a city council meeting can tell you, that you never know what item is going to get snagged during a meeting on an agenda. So the fact is that they had 20 minutes, or they had like 4 topics listed for an hour and 20-minute discussion or something like that. And among those was crime, I think, and a few other hot topic issues that they focused on, where some of the lengthier presentations that the council was hearing had more like an hour and a half dedicated to them, just because of the presentation that was required. So they took that and ran with it and said, this is all that your city council is talking about at this retreat, which ended up not being the case. And actually, I think more than an hour and a half was spent on talking about crime with Chief Boehm and other issues that were mentioned as kind of the low topic ones. And then, they stressed the Kyoto Protocol being discussed a lot, which I don't think received more than 15 or 20 minutes of discussion. So, where there needed to be attention paid, I think, and where there were issues, they discussed them as they normally do, but it wasn't compared to that agenda. It didn't feather out the way time was planned for
I'll
that.
get back
so
to you guys in a minute, but I have
So
to pay some
are
attention.
you saying that the ad was erroneous, essentially?
Well,
right?
it came out before the discussions
Right.
were had.
Okay.
So, yeah,
But
if
so
this was
in
a
the
city
end-
council that said, 19 and a half minutes, we got to move on. Sorry, crime's over. Our 20 minutes are up. Then that may have been fair to say, but,
That
it's
wasn't-
more of
that-
a fluid schedule.
Did that ever get out that the ads were actually erroneous? I mean,
That was my
any-
story
did any-
in the next day's paper.
that the ads
Yeah.
were not following reality.
Right,
So
and-
you've been vindicated.
Yeah. And there were some surprises, too, that came out of this, like Bill Watkins' economic
always the
development proposal was a surprise that was in there that, I didn't know was coming, and he took the time to describe that, and then that generated discussion of using the water fund to kind of...
And we're talking about a $2 million find from the utilities fund.
Right.
And justification for that for shovel-ready sites. So that's it. And we're arguing these days about $88,000 for a program of Parks and Rec at Paquin Towers per year. All of a sudden, people can find $2 million under some rock if they have a professional staff to do that. I mean, the city council doesn't have professional staff. We're trying to, believe me, the unprofessional, or shouldn't put it that way, the volunteer staff that we have in boards and commissions are getting better and better because they're getting more interested, because they're being more appreciated, and they're being listened to a lot more. And God knows we got a lot more support on the city council than we had before. But Bill Watkins, bless his heart, has got a whole professional staff, highly paid professionals, to find money under rocks someplace. I don't even know where the rocks are, let alone to where to
And
turn
I
them
think
over.
that's great that he is
I don't have any
being that
problem with
enterprising.
that.
Yeah.
My problem is, how do we achieve balance here? how, if you're gonna find $2 million under a rock, big rock someplace, to help folks out with to the tune of $2 million, and then all of a sudden we are going to be refused some of these requests that we make because we're worried about somebody making $88,000 a year to fund another project. It raises questions to me about balance.
Well, Carl, you're on the city council, and you'll start your budget hearings this month, or
I'm
during the month
1/7 of this pie.
I understand that, and they will present a budget for next year, and you have
Bill's budget.
That's right, and you have the option to add to, or vote for, or add back in just about any line item you want.
Well, do you think that you have an adequate knowledge of
No,
where
of
the
course
money
not.
is and what's
we
in the
don't have
budget?
any staff. I mean,
So there's the problem,
I've learned
I
a
think.
lot from the first
Right?
year that I got on. The first year I kept my mouth shut because I didn't know anything.
What?
Frankly, well, I didn't. Well, I didn't know much. I mean, I won't
And
go
kept
so
your
far
mouth
as to
shut,
say
the part that I
went-
was astounded at.
Oh,
yeah.
I didn't keep my mouth shut, but I didn't know what I was talking about.
Okay,
Let's
all
put
right.
it that way.
Okay, we'll take
and
that.
even that is tough to
Yes.
deal with. But frankly, that's the way it was. I mean, it's pretty overwhelming when you face the first budget, and the city manager tells you essentially, this is my budget, but I don't want it. It's time for you to change it. But the changes that you can make are very limited because you don't even understand the process at that point. And when you're
Right.
first on the council in the first place. Later, as you learn how to deal with the budget, you also learn that there's a continuing pressure on the city council from the city manager's office to not change the way things are because you get these arguments that, well, you can't do it that way. These expenses are in particularly defined budgets and so on. You can't move them around. We don't have that kind of flexibility, so on and so forth.
Right.
Not sure that's true.
Some
but
of that
that's,
is true.
Some of it is
Yeah.
true.
Didn't you write a story about an allowance that Bill gives them, Mr. Watkins?
They're
city-
discretionary.
That's their
that
allowance,
has
right?
increased.
Yeah.
So that went up, but there, it seemed to me there was something in that, if I remember right, that said that if that was saying that, well, if you want to restore cuts to these other programs, you'll have to take it from your discretionary
It's a
fund?
zero-sum
It's a
game,
zero-sum game. Yeah, that's the
right?
favorite
Why-
I've heard
phrase
this
of.
thing.
Why is that good?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's
Some would
true.
argue it's not.
Bill suggested this year we have 100, and he's saying, look at this. This in a budget season that's very constrained. We gave you more money. Last year you had $75,000 or $80,000. This year you're going to have $175,000.
Where's the evidence that it's constrained, though? I'm not seeing any evidence that it is constrained.
The
I mean,
evidence
you
that's
could hear it.
constrained has to do with sales tax revenues, which is what we're dependent
But if there's money under all the rocks out in the yard,
well, I don't know.
do you
about the
need- I
rocks.
mean-
The problem is
are
not
you
the
constrained?
money that rocks. The problem is that money doesn't grow on trees. And that's the harsh reality, and that's why it's a zero-sum game.
yeah, no, it doesn't.
Because
It
if
doesn't
you
grow on
take
trees. It
something-
hides under rocks.
No, if you
So
take it away from something, then it has to be,
But
there has to be an
let
offset
me
somewhere.
offer something to
Okay.
you. I offered the idea, and several of us on the city council offered the idea that okay, this is a zero-sum game. We don't have any more money. We can't raise taxes, nor probably do we want to, and so on. And we can't. Are no other revenue sources. So it seems to me that sometimes your priorities shift, and that is they probably shifted a little bit away from Parks and Rec, and they shifted towards, and we'll get to this, I hope, before this thing is over, to crime and some other issues,
Right.
because we are now a city of 100,000, actually. I just saw some census figures that the 2006 to 2007 figures were something like 96,000, and they got up to about 99,000, and now at a 2.5% increase, which is the customary average increase, we're probably over 100,000 right now.
Well, I think somebody had a baby down at Boone Hospital
Which
tonight.
is going to
That would do
cost
it.
us a ton of money in
Right.
terms of water quality stuff and all kinds of other stuff. Now that we've gotten to that
You've hit
level.
the threshold.
Yes.
That's right.
So we're having a real problem these days now with a zero-sum game, And I suggested, and several other people suggested, that maybe we ought to just take a 0.5% or a 1/4% or a 0.5%, I don't know what the numbers are, percent cut off the top dogs, the big dogs departments. Public Works, Water and Light, Parks. We can't do it off of the police department and so on. And we were told that that's impossible. You can't do that. These things are spoken for.
Well, you just
can't
wanted
work it
that as
way.
discretionary.
Yeah, to take some of those monies from the big departments and give them to the little departments, which would make a bigger difference. We were told we couldn't do that. I don't know exactly how they're, I'm not yet that sophisticated, but I'm finding out very rapidly whether or not that's a bunch of baloney or not.
Well, why isn't there a rock out in the yard for you?
Well, I haven't, because I don't have the
Because
staff
there's a
to
rock out in the yard for
Frankly,
you know, the pay increases for senior level staff. And,
you know, no
you know,
offense,
the
but I don't have a
garage.
lot of time wandering out in the yard to find rocks.
well,
And I
then-
don't have any staff to be
Well,
able
then
to
you
turn
need
these
some
rocks
you
up.
need some rock finders, buddy. And yeah, I got and that garage, that just seems like an overwhelming priority.
Well,
to me.
that's an interesting,
Well, that's one of those
that's an
examples of,
interesting idea.
it's all within itself, so if it's generating the revenue, then that parking utility
Well,
gets
you
to
can-
spend it,
but
but
you
you
know?
can
And
make
can't
those
take it
kinds of
from it.
arguments for all kinds of things, and you know that doesn't make them priorities. It makes them, you know, kind of project picks, but not necessarily priorities. I mean, when you've got the Tiger Hotel sitting downtown vacant, and that could do a whole lot of good things for the city. There's a ton of arguments that could be made for a private-public partnership for that, yet nothing's ever happened with that. But yet you see a project like this going down for $15 million, and then $2 million here, a couple million there. Council gets $175,000. It just, you know, I'm just John Q. Voter out here. This doesn't add up to me. I'm sorry.
Well, and what are we going to use that $175,000 for? Are we going to take
I guess you're
$80,000
gonna
and
rescue
and-
Paquin Towers,
Well, that's
right?
what I'm saying.
I mean,
and then
does
what
that
does
seem
that
right?
mean? What does that mean?
Well,
I
Carl,
don't know.
You haven't relinquished control over that budget, just because some of it is less than completely discretionary doesn't mean that you don't have control over that budget. You're still a
believe
member
me,
of the city
this
council.
is going to be a hell of a budget.
Oh,
fight.
I am sure.
I mean,
I
this
fully
is-
expect that.
I'm-
I have
I'm
told
really
people who
looking
have
forward to
business to
this.
take down there, do not go during the month of August and September.
It's the
because-
goofy season.
Yeah,
I mean,
and it's gonna
everybody's
be
lining
tough.
up with their hat in hand and so on and so forth.
Right.
What's the situation with the block grants? I noticed Paul rightly,
That's
I
an
believe, brought up
interesting-
the
it's
fact
an
that
interesting idea.
as I have long maintained, the city should not be spending
There-
federal block grants on basic city infrastructure. And he kind of got tamped down
No, he
a
didn't.
little bit.
No, he didn't really. What it amounted
like
to?
it.
Well, yeah.
She reported
To
it.
the uninitiated, it
Oh,
might seem
all right.
like it. I mean, the people that raise these questions, I think, eventually, that have good ideas, come back. I mean, they're kind of reborn. This is one of those good ideas. And Paul, to his credit, raised the issue of CDBG money.
Community Development
Yeah,
Block Grant.
block
right?
grant
Yeah.
money spent on roads, which has been a custom in the past. I mean, it's been
It
the way that
is.
we have dealt with that because
Kind of
the
unique
ar-
to Columbia.
Yeah, and the argument is that this is kind of an entitlement to some degree. We can get some roads improved in areas of town that would normally have to compete with other areas of town, which more of a constituency to drive the competition. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's
So
a
that we can get some
unique
road
argument.
improvements made. But the downside of it is, if you spend the money in roads and infrastructure, you have less leftovers for social programs,
Or for housing.
or for any
Or
of the,
for economic
any
development.
of those
because
other
all of
any of
those
those other
issues
kinds of
Right.
issues.
are eligible for
That's exactly
CDBG
right.
funds.
That's exactly right.
Even Pat Kelly brought up the idea of street lighting and
And-
landscaping, things like that,
and-
to really make the neighborhood look
And
better.
Paul raised the issue, rightly, I think, that we ought to reconsider the numbers that we set in terms of the percentages, how much you can spend for the infrastructure and how much you can spend for the social services. And we ought to shift it towards social services and away from infrastructure. And he has a point. And I suspect, and Jerry came to his assistance essentially and said, well, this is going to be decided year after year, and we have to make these decisions to set these limits, I suspect that those limits will be changed, because I think there is an increasing sensitivity to shift towards a little bit more towards social services and away from the infrastructure, because infrastructure can be paid for by going out to the public with hat in hand and getting bonds every few years.
Right.
And that's how you do that. I mean, I have some questions about how they decide what the priorities are, obviously. I mean, I've been talking Ballinger Road till the cows come home, and I will do so till the cows come home.
Yeah,
So-
They just won't be coming down Bellinger Lane.
So where do you think the tax billing issue of that with the city's policy plays into that? Because not all roads that are improved are tax billed.
No,
as
there's
someone
been
else pointed
more and
out,
more
but-
forgiveness for tax billing, I think, along the lines. I mean, there's been less involvement in the folks actually paying the bucks to get their roads improved. There is a contribution, but it's less of a contribution. The city is seeing this as an across-the-board improvement rather than just an improvement in a particular neighborhood. And I think that's where we're going, and I suspect this will change.
You know, if you're in neighborhoods in Columbia, like in the central city, that used to be segregated, and as a result have a far lesser standard of infrastructure historically, like sidewalks, no sidewalks, in fact, or no streets. I mean, some of the improvements recently that block grants have been spent on were very basic things like just streets, gutters, and drainage that anywhere else in town would have been eligible for normal city money. When you have areas like that that have been so stressed out over the years, to tax bill the residents there, in addition to all of this, is a double slap in the face. I fought this kind of a thing over on North 6th Street, and I used an example of where Mr. Yonku had gotten the tax bills waived for all the residents on Sunset Drive in his district for exactly the same road improvements that citizens on North 6th Street were being forced to pay tax bills on. I had to visit the city council 4 or 5 times to get 3 tax bills relieved over there. It was like fighting, the war of the Huns. And I swear I heard every possible argument, especially from Councilman Ash, especially, about why those tax bills were such a good thing for those low-income people. And I just don't see that.
Not to disparage past city councils, although that never stopped me before. But you started out with different city councils. I mean, this is a different group.
Exactly. But my point is that historically there has been a sense that almost anything goes in certain parts of town, and that should change. And changing the way block grants are spent is a good way to do that.
I think it will.
And Carl, and as you describe this, and the CDBG funds and the reallocation of priorities, really that makes that money discretionary too, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And so really you have more power over more money than $175,000.
I have so much power I don't know what to deal with it.
Right. And so I
it's
think
just amazing
I
to
think
me.
that if you do set those priorities right, and if you establish, and they could change from year to year, but if housing is the most important priority, ought to receive the
Don't
lion's
forget,
share.
Mr. Farnan, I only have 1/7 of all of that power that you're talking about.
I understand that.
And the ability to try and persuade, which I see as real important.
And the ability to be in on the discussions before they have a public hearing.
Absolutely.
Kind of like you want the developers to do.
Yeah, the developers. Let me change this up a little bit, because I would be remiss if I didn't get back to what it was that I was trying to get back to at the last meeting.
Oh, yeah, that's right, I forgot.
And that has to do with this whole law enforcement issue. In lots of layers, not the least of which, of course, there's the huge taser debate, which I'm in the middle of, and frankly, I just got an email from Bill Watkins. We are going to meet next Tuesday with the interim police chief and so on to discuss the CD that I gave to Bill Watkins, which has about 400 pages of text of solutions to this problem. And frankly, some of the police department was saying, well, 400 pages of text, I mean, we may need more than just this rest of this week. We may need, get over it. I read this all the time, every couple of weeks. I mean,
Well, they can skip the first intro part. I read part of that, Carl.
Whatever.
And the first intro part, the first 20 pages, is what we're going to tell you, we're going to tell you.
No, I agree with
Yeah.
you. I agree. Isn't that the ability to read? I mean, you go through this stuff and you figure out what's germane and what's not germane.
Right.
Anyway, there's good stuff there, and I think if we can get to that point, maybe we can clarify some of this. These are other communities that have also faced the same problems that we are facing. And unfortunately, we had a taser incident here. It's tremendous controversy. Frankly, I even talked to my daughter, who is a police officer, and I had a very different perspective. I said, "Why did they taser this guy the second time when he was over? When he could hurt himself? Seems to be against the policy that we have, even in the policies that we have now." She said, "Oh, I have another question for you. Why did they taser him in the first place when he was sitting down?" Which is something I really never really thought about. But aside from all of this, I mean, the issues as to whether or not to do this, I provided the police department and the city manager with guidelines that satisfied both the ACLU and the Amnesty International, which is what we're facing now, because we're facing a lawsuit from the ACLU about this stuff. There are other communities have dealt with this, and if the policy and the training is sufficient, it seems to satisfy even those groups. That's what we need to talk about.
Well, Amnesty International still would call for the moratorium on the use of tasers.
I know.
And so it wouldn't satisfy them. It does satisfy ACLU in many communities and in most states. And mostly what they adhere to is a list of about 50 different principles that can be
Yes.
applied and adopted. And
Yes.
almost everywhere in the United States that has adopted the use of a taser has adopted similar sorts of standards.
That's correct.
And that's how they've dealt with it in other
And
communities.
that's what I suggested to the city manager and the police chief, to take a look at what has satisfied these folks in the past, and I think that would adequately serve our needs if we can deal with that. There's another issue too, and I want to get back to you because that's one of the issues with the police thing, this taser thing, and you can comment on that if that's what you would like.
Crime beat cat.
The other issue is an unfortunate appointment that I made to the advisory committee that was supposed to select the police chief. I met a gentleman, his name Darrell Foster. I was impressed with this guy. Knew nothing about him. We don't have a staff. My first inclination is not to do CaseNet, not to do a lot of these background checks, because up until this point, and maybe we have to, and maybe we're at that point now. I don't know. I made the recommendation to Bill Watkins that he appoint this fellow to the advisory committee, because I had participated with him in a couple of discussions, community-wide discussions about crime and kids, and I thought what he had to say made some sense. I respected his opinions.
But you didn't appoint him.
I
You
didn't
said you
appoint
appointed
him. I
You-
recommended him
you
for
recommended him
appointment.
for
This was
appointment.
Bill
Oh.
Watkins' appointment
All right,
to
I
this
got you.
group.
I got you.
Because the city council has no authority to affect hiring and firing, which is what this was all about in terms
So
of.
this group was, aren't most of these
Appointed-
commissions appointed by the council?
Most
No.
of them are.
But this one
This
not.
one
This
has
is
to
not
do
a-
with the hiring of
This is not a board and
staff
commission.
member.
This is a special committee to help
Really?
Bill
Yeah.
appoint or to
hire.
hire
Yes.
a police chief.
So
essentially.
it's in his control?
It's in his control.
Yes.
Oh, I didn't
Hiring and
realize
firing
that.
So
is
I
all
sent him
with-
Well, I
several.
knew that, but
Yeah.
not this
I
little
sent
committee,
him.
'cause these are
I
volunteer
sent him
folks.
several recommendations. I sent him Darrell Foster's recommendation because he was the first ward ambassador. I think he was an impressive character as far as I was concerned. I also sent him several other recommendations that he didn't take of lawyers in town. He decided not to appoint lawyers because there might be a conflict of interest because of the legal aspects of all of this stuff. But he did accept Mr. Foster's recommendation. He didn't check it out any more than I did. This is not something we normally do. I will now, I guarantee you that. And I want you to tell your story as to how this happened. I mean, because you called me one morning or early afternoon and told me that, were you aware of this fellow? He had 4 felony convictions on one incident. I guess it was 19, I don't know, what, the year? Do you
Which one?
The latest one were 4 felony incidences relating to
1998.
1998, regarding to the discharge of a weapon and regarding there were minors involved that were witnessing and so on. And then he had worse. He had one conviction for a felony in '68 or something like that, or '69 in Indiana, which I also didn't know about. But on top of everything else, I recommended him in May, and in June, he was charged with a misdemeanor for a domestic problem. Well, when this hit the newspaper, when she called me and said, "Are you aware of the felony?" I said, "No, I wasn't aware of the felony, but it seems to me if it was 10 years ago and the fellow had a felony and he's done his thing and all the rest of it, he was an impressive character, I would still support him." I knew nothing about...
Till the next day.
Yeah, till the next day.
Right.
About any of the rest of this. And that's my fault. I guess I should have. It's such a sad commentary on where we are these days that I have to... I really have to make Google checks and CaseNet checks and everything on people that I'm just making a recommendation to Bill Watkins, who's the city manager, and it's his personnel decision to do that. And I have to check this before I even make that recommendation. I'm not excusing myself. I probably should have. Maybe I should have. How do you think... Do you think we could have fixed this? I mean, is there a better way to do this? I mean,
and you got like some anonymous envelope about all this guy, or what?
Well, it first
Anyway.
came in a tip, but then, we followed up and, the other was just something else that someone sends. But, because someone actually sent me an anonymous envelope, your case net printout, which, was already discussed and everything during your election, as I understand. So that's neither here nor there. But following up on this, and it was my fault to not make you aware of the pending charges when you're going down and you can't look at these over online. So when we're investigating
well, to be fair, I
these things,
think I told
exactly
you
sure.
I don't really care. I mean,
Yeah.
I think
And to be fair,
I
you
did
didn't
tell
know
you
about
that. I mean,
the pending
I mean,
charges when it went. But is there a better way of finding out what?
How did you find
people
out
are
though?
involved on?
How did it get out that he had any charges at all? Who
That
did
was
that?
an email tip.
That was an email tip.
Yeah, we were emailed with that information.
Well, I have to say, I've emailed tips into the Trib before about all kind of different things, and I mean, I'm going to probably say that maybe 1 in 10 has ever acted on, including some people that ran for, or I think were declaring or trying to run for mayor or First Ward Council. One of the individuals running for First Ward Council last year, or a couple of years ago, had a very long rap sheet that was never discussed. So how did this manage to penetrate get out there? I just thought it was odd.
It is for the police chief.
Yeah, right.
You don't think
but,
that makes any difference? With
well,
pending charges,
I think somebody running for council ought to be, they got a long rap sheet. That ought to be
It should
reported.
be. I agree with you. I
But
think
it
in the
wasn't.
one case, if we're thinking of the same case, he never even filed. So you're not going to dredge that up with someone who wasn't serious about running.
If you've got somebody that's announced, though, I would think you would write something.
The strange part about this is this was an appointment to an advisory board to help the city manager pick a police chief. I mean, to some degree, you can make the argument that this guy has unique credentials, since he's been on that side of the law, to do that. And if he's cleaned up his act, I mean, do we believe in rehabilitation or not? I mean, are we supposed to totally shun these people 10 years ago. Now, I admit that there's a problem here because of the pending thing, but I don't want to find him guilty either. I know what domestic disputes are all about, and that's very easy to file a charge, and that hasn't been proven yet.
Has
So
everybody on the committee been case netted now?
Well, I don't know.
Carl, did you go home and
The
case
answer
net?
is yes. No.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, from the paper, I'm sure, and I'm sure the city manager has as well. I mean, I'm sure you learned his lesson as well, but it just is a sad commentary. I mean, you know, but I also criticize the community or the local government in terms of being the old boy network and being the small town thing. We're not a small town anymore. We're 100,000 people, and we have to face reality that we have to understand these circumstances. We're gonna see this again because the board the oversight board that's deciding about the civilian review board for the police department has punted with the idea that people who have had felonies more than 10 years old cannot serve on that committee. They did not come to any conclusion. They didn't make any recommendation with that. They just passed it along to city council. So I'm going to have to decide that son of a gun too, I guess.
Or just make another appointment.
Or make another appointment. The easy way would be to say no, heck no, and nobody has any record. On the other hand, I do have some. I guess I can do this on television. I have some liberal credentials. I'm not a knee-jerk liberal, but there is something I think to be said for people who have made a mistake and paid for their mistake and are doing the right thing. I think we need to embrace them and bring them back in the community. Not to say that I'm dealing with current pending issues. I think that's wrong. But I'm going to have a hard time deciding on this.
Well, Carl,
stuff.
I would think that there would be some kind of a process before anybody gets on any board to at least turn in a resume or at least provide some sort of credentialing.
But that's what usually happens on boards and commissions normally.
Yes.
This isn't a normal board and commission.
I
This
know,
was something that was appointed by the city manager, and he just asked the city council's input as to what we thought were recommendations. That's all this amounted to.
And so you probably should do the same process.
Well, we will. I'm sure in the past.
And I don't know the individual well enough to comment about his fitness for the board, so I won't.
Well, that's another issue. Well, once again, we're having a lot of fun here, but we're running out of time. We never seem to have enough time to talk about all these issues. We will continue this discussion. We continue it every month. And hopefully a lot of the same players will be back. I intend to continue to invite the Fourth Estate. I think that's kind of an objective.
Scary, isn't it?
Yeah, it's scary, but, well, it's only fair. They interview us, we can interview them. That's only fair. But at this point, we're running out of time. So from all of us at Counterpoint, and until we meet again, good night to you and to yours.